as Ukraine intensifies its pleas for more heavy weapons from Western allies. Well, earlier, the three leaders visited Irpin, a Kyiv suburb that was partially destroyed by Russian forces early in the war. This is what Chancellor Scholz had to say.
The destruction this war is causing is terrible. It's even worse when you see how completely pointless the violence we're seeing here is. Innocent civilians have been affected, houses have been destroyed, a whole city with absolutely no military infrastructure was destroyed. And that says a lot about the brutality of the Russian war of aggression, which is simply about destruction and conquest, and we have to keep that in mind in everything we decide.
We can now speak to our correspondent, Emmanuel Scholz, who is in Kyiv at the iconic Maidan Square. Hello to you, Emma. So, the leaders of the EU's three biggest countries, Germany, France, and Italy, are finally in Kyiv today, meeting with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Just how significant is today's visit?
Well, Mariana, of course, it's highly significant on a diplomatic point of view. Volodymyr Zelenskyy, since the beginning of the war, almost 4 months ago, has been welcoming the support from the West. He has been welcoming leaders coming here, allies coming here to show this support. But of course, this was highly anticipated that leaders of the biggest European countries, France, Germany, and Italy, would come here to show their support. They've been voicing it for a few months now, but this is their first visit, and of course, highly anticipated, highly awaited. And the Ukrainian president shared his joy at this visit. He already shared it on on his social media. He shared pictures of the discussions there. We're waiting the press conference that follows those discussions any moment now.
That's right, Emmanuel. And as we wait for that press conference, any idea of what we can expect?
Well, this is the big unknown. Like we know that discussions have been taking place. Will there be some declarations, some, words of support, thoughts and prayers, as there have been over the past 4 months? Will there be some reassurance that the heavy weapons that have been promised by the Western power will finally arrive in Ukraine? Will there be some announcements of more support, be it financial, humanitarian, or more support when it comes to weapons? We do not know yet, so everybody is just waiting to see just what it will be about.
Well, we do know the leaders traveled on an overnight train. There were some photos released to the media of them sitting in that train car. Emmanuel, what's the security been like with such high-profile visitors in Kyiv, in a country that is in the middle of a war?
Exactly, Mariana. You've expressed that. It's a country at war. So usually, head of states would travel to Kyiv, Ukrainian capital, by plane. They took an overnight train. These last for hours. This is also how I came here in Kyiv. And I think that really gives them the full picture of the situation here. Also the fact that they visited Irpin, which is just in the suburbs here of Kyiv. They visited Irpin, which was the place of a very big battle back in March, a battle where a lot of civilians died, a lot of Ukrainian armed forces also died there. The fact that they could see with their own eyes the amount, the extent of destruction caused by this war, this really is a game changer, I think, for foreign leaders coming here, because it's all very easy, if you will, to talk about the war when you're not in the middle of it, but they can see now with their own eyes the damage caused and continuing to be caused by the Russian aggression against Ukraine.
DW's correspondent in Kyiv, Emmanuel Scholz. Emmanuel, thank you so much. Well, to talk a bit more about the visit of the three EU leaders, I'm joined in the studio by DW's chief political editor, Michaela Köfner. Michaela, hello. So this is quite the long-anticipated visit by the German Chancellor and French leader, and also Mario Draghi. Why did they finally decide to go to Kyiv now?
Well, I think one key issue is that they actually are going together. It is a joint symbolic act that Ukraine is part of Europe, that's carefully choreographed symbolism. It also makes it easier for German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to really explain why it took him so long. The reason he cited was that first the president was supposed to go, who of course was not welcome, so that caused some politically ruffled feathers there between the two countries, which of course cannot be taken lightly in the light of the continued criticism against Olaf Scholz, against Germany, for dragging its heels on actually getting those pledged heavy weapons on the ground.
Well, it's not just this slowness in getting weapons to Ukraine. There's also been quite a bit of criticism of Emmanuel Macron, in addition to Scholz, for continuing to maintain this channel of communication with Putin, for speaking to him. Some say that this was not a good idea. Many Ukrainian officials are not happy about that. Will they be able to resolve these differing attitudes about communicating with Russia?
Well, I think there's a difference in what public statements and behind the scenes is. We certainly heard direct criticism from Poland for those talks continuing, saying that there's no point to continue talking with Vladimir Putin, also even drawing a parallel to who would have called Hitler back in that very dark chapter. It was pointless to talk to him. Well, at the same time, there is a certain sense of appreciation for the fact that there is still lines of communication with Vladimir Putin, and at the same time a lot of conversations on the phone, but now also in person with European leaders, between Volodymyr Zelenskyy, but he has criticised Olaf Scholz for what he's called a balancing act between Ukraine and relations with Russia, and I don't think that this visit will have completely dispersed that.
DW's chief political editor, Michaela Köfner. Michaela, thank you so very much for your insights. Well, to date, the German government has indeed approved the delivery of around 350 million euros worth of weapons to Ukraine. Kyiv has been making urgent calls for more weaponry, such as tanks and rocket launch systems, but there have been accusations from the opposition here in Berlin as well that, as we've been hearing, Germany has dragged its heels when it comes to supplying those heavy weapons.
Olaf Scholz under pressure. Wherever he goes, the German Chancellor feels compelled to defend Germany's record on military support for Ukraine. Germany is one of the main military supporters of Ukraine. Nobody delivers as much as us. There are a few that are also doing a lot, like the United States, but Germany is one of the countries that is committing its capabilities on a very large scale. We have provided large numbers of anti-tank weapons, anti-aircraft missiles and ammunition in huge quantities. But the weapons Germany has so far provided are small fry compared to heavy weapon systems other countries have already delivered, and that Ukraine says it desperately needs. In a historic vote at the end of April, the German parliament agreed to supply heavy weapons to Ukraine. But so far, not a single piece of heavy artillery has reached Ukraine from Germany. But much has been promised. Part of Scholz's pledge are 7 German-made howitzer 2000s. Ukrainian soldiers are currently being trained how to use them at a German army base. The howitzers will likely be sent to Ukraine at the end of June. The German Chancellor also agreed to provide 50 Gepard or Cheetah anti-aircraft tanks, the first of which could be delivered in July. At the start of June, Scholz announced that Iris-T surface-to-air missiles would also be readied for Ukraine's use. These missiles are Germany's most modern air defense system and would enable Ukraine to defend an entire city from Russian air attacks, Scholz said. Again, there is no clear deadline for when Ukraine will receive them. On a recent visit to Berlin, the head of Ukraine's parliament welcomed Scholz's announcement, but stressed that deliveries needed to arrive quickly. With dozens of Ukrainians dying every day, the country has no time to lose.
We spoke earlier to German lawmaker Roderich Kiesewetter from the opposition party, the CDU. We asked him if his party shared some of the blame for the slow weapons deliveries, given they governed Germany for many years until last December.
We all are responsible, but it's also the truth that Germany is the fourth strongest deliverer of armaments. It has the fourth strongest armaments industry of the world, and this industry is ready to deliver, but they must not. They don't get the guarantee, they don't get the allowance, the permission to deliver. So this is not part of the former government, this is the responsibility of the Chancellor. And the same Chancellor who is now working for the Zeitenwende has hampered the 2% goal, has hampered the armed drones as finance minister, and he was also not willing to pursue the goal to reform the nuclear sharing. And we really support that he has changed the issue, which the former government couldn't do because it was blocked by our coalition partner. But it doesn't help to have a blame and shame game. It is very helpful that this government has changed the former position. And my party is responsible, yes, that's true, but we were not focused on the Bundeswehr. We were focused on social welfare. We were focused on other items. And it's also a lesson learned that all parties who have responsibility for our country should define security not only with social welfare and cohesion, but also with economic competitiveness, domestic and foreign security. So we need a culture of security, and this was neglected since 1990, since the unification. And this is also a very tremendous, a very important lesson learned, that we have to invest in our security independent from the threat analysis.
The governor in Ukraine's Luhansk region has again underscored the urgent need for more military support. He says Russian forces are advancing in their assault on the key city of Severodonetsk. He said a Russian airstrike hit a building sheltering civilians, killing at least 3 people in neighboring Lysychansk, a city in Donbass that is also taking a heavy toll.
In the distance, the sound of Russian shelling. For the people in Lysychansk, the twin city of Severodonetsk, the chance to escape is getting smaller and smaller. Ukrainian police officers drive from house to house to find those who want to leave. But for many here, it feels like they're giving up their town.
We weren't sure until it became unbearable. Then I got sick.
She has an endless list of illnesses, and I'm also sick. If there was a hospital here, I would have stayed here until the very last moment.
Only a few kilometers away in Severodonetsk, leaving has become nearly impossible. With all the main bridges destroyed, the city is now cut off. Ukraine says more than 500 civilians are hiding inside the Azot chemical factory alongside Ukrainian soldiers. Moscow announced a humanitarian corridor for the civilians, but then claimed Ukrainian shelling disrupted the plan. With Moscow having more manpower and weapons, it's becoming increasingly difficult for the Ukrainians to hold their few remaining positions in the city. A Russian deadline for the forces in the chemical plant to surrender has passed. Former Ukrainian President Poroshenko told DW Ukraine will not give in.
Situation is extremely difficult, and the concentration of troops there is enormous. But our heroic soldiers is keeping Severodonetsk. We keeping the Azot chemical plant, and we never surrender.
Away from the Donbass, Russian forces have been aiming for other high-value targets. This footage, shared by the Russian military, claims to show high-precision, low-range missiles targeting a depot in the western Lviv region, where ammunition for NATO-supplied weapons is stored. If true, it could be Russia's latest effort to disrupt the international supply of weapons.
The number of people on the move is unprecedented. Most are forced to flee their homes because of conflict, violence, and persecution. According to a new report by the United Nations Refugee Agency, at the end of last year, nearly 90 million people around the world had fled their homes. That's more than double the number 10 years ago. And by the end of this year, the number is expected to top 100 million for the first time. This latest increase is being driven by an escalation of existing conflicts and by new violence. The war in Ukraine, as an example, has triggered one of the fastest and largest refugee crises since the Second World War. 7.5 million Ukrainians have fled their country, and more than 8 million are now internally displaced. Chris Meltzer of the UNHCR's Berlin office says the scale of the Ukraine crisis should not distract from the plight of displaced people everywhere.
We're talking a lot about Ukraine and not about, just mention South Sudan. There are 2.4 million refugees from South Sudan. There are millions of internally displaced persons in many countries, especially in African countries. And we have not talked that much about Syria in recent weeks and months. On the other hand, the Ukraine situation probably shows that everybody can be a refugee suddenly, that these people indeed need help. And actually, it's not the big difference between the refugees over there and refugees here. I was in so many places around the world, and the pictures are always the same of people trying to flee, trying to save their lives.
NATO is vowing to bolster its forces along the alliance's eastern borders in the face of Russia's aggression. NATO defense ministers have been meeting in Brussels as the alliance aims to reset its strategic vision. The meeting comes ahead of a summit later this month that will seek to set a new course for the coming years. Speaking after the meeting, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said Russia's invasion of Ukraine would change NATO's security strategy long term.
Russia's war against Ukraine poses the biggest threat to our security in decades. So we must set out NATO's response for the longer term. At the summit, we will take decisions to make NATO even stronger and more agile in a world that is more dangerous and more competitive.
All right, for more, we can speak to our Brussels correspondent, Terry Schultz. Hello to you, Terry. So Jens Stoltenberg there talking about new challenges for NATO, but how does the alliance intend to meet those challenges?
That's right. The NATO Secretary General calls Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the war on Ukraine, a game changer for the alliance. And he has said in the past that NATO is going to have to live with a degree of uncertainty now that this is the new normal. And so the alliance is having to reallocate its resources. This is not how it expected to go into the future. But just in the last few weeks, in fact, they're talking about a new model for NATO's resources. And that includes putting more troops, more ammunition, pre-positioning equipment along the eastern flank in what was initially thought just to be a short-term reinforcement. Now those reinforcements are likely to be permanent or at least long-term, since, of course, no one can predict either the length of the war in Ukraine nor what Russia will do after that. So this is certainly a new way of thinking in NATO, and they're right now drafting what they call the strategic concept, the next 10-year plan for NATO, and that is going to be presented at the summit, and it's likely to look very different than one would have thought even a year ago.
Well, NATO also has said it wants to increase its support for Ukraine. What could that look like?
Well, what NATO does is coordinate support among allies for Ukraine. It doesn't have its own weapons. But what was talked about at this defense ministers meeting was in particular moving Ukraine from the donations, the contributions of allies from Soviet-era equipment, the type of thing that was rushed there just when the war started, to NATO-grade equipment, really upgrading what is given to Ukraine to what NATO countries are using. And one of the reasons for that is quite practical. They're running out of ammunition for the old equipment. It's not made anymore. And so the Ukrainians are pleading for more ammunition, and it's simply not available. So as they are able to train Ukrainian soldiers on the new equipment, NATO allies are going to be giving these more modern weapons. And of course, we did hear just at this NATO defense ministers meeting that they're going to be getting multiple rocket launch systems, something the Ukrainians have been asking for and which they are now able to use as well.
Well, just yesterday, the French President Emmanuel Macron again talked about the need for Ukraine to negotiate with Russia, albeit once the war was won by Ukraine, as he put it. But the idea of Ukraine negotiating with Russia, do other NATO countries agree that this is key?
I think the context is really important. Nobody would argue that they should keep fighting instead of coming to some sort of a peace deal. But there has been a lot of outrage among some of the countries that feel that Macron is giving too much to Putin, giving too much credit to Putin. Of course, we've seen comments from Chancellor Scholz also that have been met with some displeasure by some NATO allies. Comments like Russia should not be humiliated, we should treat Russia as a great power. This, of course, is very disconcerting to countries, especially along the eastern border there. You've heard the Baltic states ask for phone calls to President Putin to stop. They think that no one should be negotiating with him over the phone, that nobody would have called Hitler back in World War II, and that's a comparison that they often use. So I think there is a lot of rumbling about the Macron statements and ones that he's made in the past, because it depends a lot on what the situation is on the ground, and that Ukraine not be asked to give up territory that Russia illegally took from it.
Well, you mentioned Latvia, and Latvia's defense minister said he wants more NATO troops, and he's fed up of paying for lunch for the others. Is this possibly a sign that NATO has some cracks?
There are certainly differences between the way some of the eastern flank countries, particularly the Baltics, view this situation. There has been some displeasure with the fact that the Germans announced a large contingent of troop reinforcements for their enhanced forward presence, the one that they lead in Lithuania. And then it was sort of discovered a bit later that these troops wouldn't actually be on the ground in Lithuania, that they would be trained and they would exercise with Lithuanian troops, but they would actually stay home in Germany unless they were needed. That is not what the Baltic countries want to hear. They've long been asking for more boots on the ground, more troops stationed permanently on their territory. That's something that Poland is also interested in. And so I think that as the negotiations on this new model stretch over the next 2 weeks heading into the NATO summit, you're going to see a lot of back and forth on just how many troops should be forward stationed there on the eastern flank and how many can be trained and resting at home. But there's going to definitely be ammunition prepositioned, some heavy equipment, so that the movements of these reinforcements, these pre-assigned troops, could at least be more quickly done than it would be today.
DW correspondent Terry Schultz in Brussels. Terry, we appreciate it. Thank you. Well, for Ukrainian refugees who've ended up being cared for in German hospitals, there can be few more comforting things than being treated by a doctor who speaks their own language. For now, Ukrainian doctors are allowed to work in hospitals, but only under supervision. They have to fulfill a number of requirements before they can go solo. Even so, some are making full use of that time.
Vavara is 2 years old. She has leukemia. Her cancer therapy in Ukraine was stopped by the war. She is now being treated at the University Hospital in Essen, and fortunately, Dr. Nina Betsko is here too. Dr. Betsko speaks Ukrainian because she fled the war herself. She was a pediatrician in Kyiv and is not only able to help the young patients here at the university clinic, she is also a valuable support for the parents.
Yes, her mother says it's very good because she can't understand or explain anything. And now it's better because she can talk to someone, and I have someone to help me with translation.
There are 32 young cancer patients from Ukraine being treated at the university hospital. Dr. Betsko's presence has been extremely helpful. It's a huge relief for us to have such a doctor and perfect interpreter amongst us. And she is always ready to help. Today, for example, not being able to communicate with her mother was a big problem. Nina Betsko learned German at school. She is always open to meeting the cancer patients' parents because they have lived through similar experiences.
People no longer have a normal life. And I lost my life too. I have a different life now.
Here in Essen, Dr. Betsko can, for now, only work with patients under supervision. She still needs a few certificates to practice medicine in Germany.
It's a pity that she's only allowed to work under supervision at the moment, given the situation. So she can't make or implement her own decisions. I think it would not only be fair, but actually right for her to be able to work here as a fully licensed doctor, and as soon as possible.
Dr. Betsko has been living with friends in Essen, but for her it was difficult just sitting around at home. It was a stroke of luck that the university clinic started a program that enabled Ukrainian refugees to work in different parts of the clinic. For Nina Betsko, who is 26, it has also been a good opportunity to develop further as a medical professional.
Yes, it's important for my future. I can also learn things. I can learn how the system works, how everything works here. It's very useful for me.
Even if Nina can imagine a future of working in Germany, she would like to return to Kyiv as soon as possible. But for now, children like Philomena are happy she is here, a pediatrician from home.
Let's get a check now of some of the other stories making news around the world. Australia's new government has announced a pledge to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 43% by 2030. It was one of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's key election issues. Officials say the country is turning the corner on climate change, blamed for extreme weather events that have battered Australia in recent years. Nigerian authorities are searching for 17 people who were kidnapped in the capital, Abuja. A user on Twitter posted a message saying she had been taken by men disguised as police officers. Pregnant women are allegedly among those taken. Kidnappings in the capital are uncommon. To Brazil now, where police say a man has confessed to fatally shooting an indigenous expert and a British journalist who went missing earlier this month. The suspect led officers to a remote area where he said the bodies were buried. The search for Dom Phillips and Bruno Pereira has shed light on tensions between local indigenous communities and illegal poachers, fishermen, and mining companies in the Amazon.
A tragic end to an 11-day search. Brazilian police say the bodies of missing British journalist Dom Phillips and Brazilian indigenous expert Bruno Pereira may have been found. Authorities say a suspect confessed to fatally shooting the two men.
The first suspect arrested in this case confessed to the crime. He described it in detail and pinpointed where he had buried the bodies.
Clues emerged throughout the week. A spot of blood on a suspect's boat, the belongings of the missing men. But authorities drew criticism for dragging their feet on the investigation. Members of Brazil's indigenous agency FUNAI, which Pereira had worked for, held a vigil for the two men. They are protesting what they see as the government's complicity.
Bruno and Dom were not adventurers. They were exceptional role models at the forefront of their work. They were violently murdered by criminals in the Javari Valley, who the Brazilian state, under the Bolsonaro government, did not combat.
The two men had received threats for their work in the Javari region, renowned for illegal fishing, logging, mining, and drug trafficking. Their killings are a grim reminder to indigenous rights workers in the region of the dangers they face.
We'd now like to return to our top story. The leaders of France, Germany, and Italy are in Kyiv in a show of solidarity with Ukraine. Olaf Scholz, Emmanuel Macron, and Mario Draghi have been holding talks with Volodymyr Zelenskyy, along with Romanian President Klaus Iohannis at the presidential palace. They've been holding a press conference, which we will bring you shortly. The visit comes after days of speculation over whether it would go ahead, and as Ukraine intensifies its pleas for more heavy weapons from Western allies. Earlier, the three leaders visited Irpin, a Kyiv suburb that was partially destroyed by Russian forces early in the war. During that visit, this is what Chancellor Scholz had to say.
The destruction this war is causing is terrible. It's even worse when you see how completely pointless the violence we're seeing here is. Innocent civilians have been affected, houses have been destroyed, a whole city with absolutely no military infrastructure was destroyed. And that says a lot about the brutality of the Russian war of aggression, which is simply about destruction and conquest, and we have to keep that in mind in everything we decide.
And we can now bring you that press conference in Kyiv between Zelenskyy, the Ukrainian president.
У більшості областей нашої країни звучала ця сирена. І це доводить, що Росія не обирає. Не обирає, кому і коли погрожувати. Не обирає, кому в Європі дійсно дарувати безпеку. Російська агресія проти України – це агресія проти всієї Європи.
Russian aggression is aggression against Europe, entire united Europe. It's aggression against us, against our shared values. And therefore, we should be united in our response. Today, Ukrainians are in the front line, fighting against the Russian strikes, but we are not alone. And today's meeting, today's format proves that we understand each other fully. We know and we understand that we need to reinforce Ukrainian defense.
Ми говорили про скоординованість наших підходів до економічної підтримки наших громадян, економічної підтримки нашої держави та у післявоєнній відбудові.
We have analyzed our common possibilities for addressing the food crisis that has been provoked by the Russian Federation, and we need to do all we can so as not to allow the Russians to move on with their I would like to welcome Mario Draghi, Prime Minister of Italy. I would like to welcome President Iohannis of Romania. I'm welcoming President of France, Macron, and I would like to welcome the Federal Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, Olaf Scholz. Dear friends, thank you very much for being with us now at the time when we're taking important historical decisions for Europe, for entire Europe. And I'm very happy and I'm very grateful for you to having come here and that you have gone to Irpin first. You could see firsthand what the Russian invaders have been doing in Ukraine. And our negotiations show that our main strength and our most effective weapon is unity. Everything depends on this unity, and once you arrived to the railway station in Kyiv, you already heard the sirens, air defense sirens wailing. You know the sound now, and it shows that Russia is indiscriminate in their threats. They are not going to give any security, and Russian aggression against Ukraine. It's aggression against Europe, entire Europe, against entire united Europe. It's an aggression against our shared values, and therefore our response should be united. Today, Ukrainians are in the front line fighting against the Russian strikes, but we are not alone. And this is supported by the format of today's meeting. We spoke in the spirit of full understanding each other. We spoke about the needs for reinforcing the defense of Ukraine. I'm very grateful to all the leaders for discussing the steps that need to be taken. We spoke about the coordination of economic support that shall be given to our state, citizens, and all. We also spoke about the post-war reconstruction. We spoke about ways of addressing the food crisis that has been provoked by the Russian Federation. We need to stop the Russians from the realization of their plan to blackmail with hunger the countries in Asia and Africa, as those countries are no longer receiving food from Ukraine. We have also spoke about the continuation of the sanction pressure to be exerted on the Russian Federation. We spoke about the future of Europe. We spoke about the future European integration of Ukraine. I have informed my friends about the current situation on the front line. I spoke about the situation in the Donbass, in the Kharkiv region, in the south of Ukraine. I also spoke about the missile strikes that we are suffering from every single day. Those are the airstrikes against our citizens, and we have already been struck by 3,000 missiles. Usually they are targeting civilian infrastructure. We need to reinforce our defense, and we do cherish the support that is being given to us by our partners. We are receiving more heavy weaponry. We will be receiving MLRS systems and so on. Every such delivery of weaponry is saving human lives. We need to stop the Russians from killing Ukrainians and from destroying our cities. There is a direct collateral. The more heavy weaponry we receive, the faster we shall liberate our people, the faster we shall liberate our lands. The majority of our people are waiting for the liberation of their territory of Ukraine. Today we have spoken about the diplomatic efforts that are being made by many parties so as to return to peace. We understand that the Russian Federation is not ready to take real action, to talk in real terms. The Russian Federation does not want peace. Russia wants only war and nothing but war. Here we're speaking at the Mariinsky Palace, and the Russian Federation, as we speak, are continuing their brutal aggression in the Donbass. They're advancing in the Kharkiv region. They are reinforcing their strongholds in the south of our country. We need to understand that there is no alternative to peace. We need to start looking for peace. And today, when the air defense sirens started wailing, we understood that Russia is looking for more ways and means of intimidating Europe for grabbing more and more land, our land. Russia has the aim of breaking Ukraine down and thus breaking Europe. Russia wants to show that European unity shall not be effective, allegedly, and that the European values shall not work for the defense of freedom. This is what they're aiming at, and therefore we need to thwart their scenario and to show that Europe shall remain free, united and democratic. And the main manifestation of our strong and joint position is giving support to our integration with the European Union. The history of Europe shows the correctness and the positive response of the EU to the Ukrainian aspirations. The candidate status for Ukraine may historically reinforce freedom in Europe and will become one of the most important political decisions in the beginning of the 21st century. Such a decision shall be our joint success, historic success. Of course, we understand that our path to the European Union is a long way. It's not just a step, but we need to begin. And we're ready to work so that Ukraine shall eventually become a fully fledged member of the European Union. Ukrainians are already on this way. We're moving towards receiving the candidate status. The public opinion polling shows that the majority in the EU member states and most Europeans support the idea of European integration of Ukraine. We have the highest level of political support for European integration also among the Ukrainian people. We have spoken about sanctions and the new sanctions to be imposed that are necessary so as to restore peace. The sanction package must be discussed, and we are going to talk in greater detail about further reconstruction of Ukraine once the war is over. We are going to talk about that in greater detail about this press conference. We are going to talk about the measures that need to be taken so as to compensate the losses sustained by our citizens, by our companies, by our state. The Ukrainian government is working on that actively. We also need to talk about the ways of addressing the global food crisis. We need to unblock our seaports, but this blockade should be stopped by the one who imposed the blockade, that is the Russian Federation and the Russian fleet. Romania is helping with the transport of Ukrainian cargo, grain included, and therefore I have spoken to the Romanian president on increasing such transport possibilities. This visit paid to Kyiv by our friends is a historic event. I thank you for these negotiations. We are ready to reinforce Ukraine, to strengthen security in Europe. Thank you very much for your kind visits. I give the floor to the Prime Minister of Italy.
Buongiorno a tutti. Oggi è una giornata storica per l'Europa. Italia, Francia e Germania, tre paesi fondatori dell'Unione Europea, e il Presidente della Romania, Klaus Iohannis, sono venuti in Ucraina per offrire il loro sostegno incondizionato al Presidente Zelenskyy e al popolo ucraino. Un popolo che si è fatto esercito per respingere l'aggressione della Russia. If
you're just joining us, we've been listening to a press conference by Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the president of Ukraine, who today welcomed a visit from Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz, the French President Emmanuel Macron, and Italian President Mario Draghi. Mario Draghi just began to speak. We don't have a translation, so Michaela Köfner, our chief political editor, is in the studio with me to talk a little bit about Zelenskyy's remarks. Michaela, Zelenskyy called the visit of the three leaders of the largest EU countries a historic visit. Why is this visit so important for Ukraine?
Well, first of all, despite still listening to Italy's Prime Minister in that press conference, this is a taped press conference, so we know that all four who travelled there today have come out, and basically the present that they brought is a pledge that they would support the EU candidacy status of Ukraine, which is so craved for by Ukraine's President Zelenskyy as a kind of guarantee into the future, and more than just symbolism and commitment, which brings us back to why Olaf Scholz can now claim to have not just gone for a photo opportunity. He was asked for weeks, for months almost, why he hadn't been to Kyiv. Now there's a joint visit. There's a concrete commitment from those key nations indeed. Germany, France, Italy, also Romania, not also representing the East, but the EU is still divided over this. And now everybody will be looking towards Brussels, what the decision there will be. But it is a key pledge, and also pledge of more military support, both from Olaf Scholz, who was not very concrete in what exactly that will entail. French President Emmanuel Macron said he would send 6 additional César howitzers, already having sent about a dozen, so clear commitments made here.
Well, one thing that Zelenskyy kept underscoring is how Russia wants to show that European unity will not work, that European values cannot succeed. So what is happening in his country will determine the fate of Europe as a whole. This gesture by these three leaders to support Ukraine in its bid to become an EU member, is it enough, though? Is it enough?
I'm not going to judge on that. If you ask Volodymyr Zelenskyy, it's not enough. He's already asking for a 7th sanctions package. He handed over a list. On that today, he put on that list a full gas embargo, and this is coming against the backdrop of Russia reducing how much gas is being sent through that vital Nord Stream 1 pipeline towards Germany and Europe. And clearly he feels that more needs to be done, and most of all, that weapons deliveries need to be speeded up because every day counts. Both sides share the assessment. In fact, Germany has assessed Ukraine as being essentially held hostage. That's also the assessment of the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, because Putin is against European unity, is against the concept of a democratic state, and that is what's at stake. And Ukraine is on that front line. The conclusions of what action is needed and how fast is not the same. And these countries here, Germany and France, the French president and German chancellor, are the two European leaders who still speak on the phone with Vladimir Putin. They've been criticized from Poland for that, but at the same time, this is something that is also being welcomed, and it's also in Ukraine's interest, because Ukraine too says it wants the negotiating table. It wants to stop the fighting, wants to stop the war, and it's the Russian side, it's Vladimir Putin, who does not want to sit down for talks.
Well, some Ukrainian officials expressed concern that during this meeting, Zelenskyy would be pressured to agree to some concessions, to give up some territory to Russia if it meant a ceasefire, and the fear that additional weapon support will be perceived as a way of prolonging the war, prolonging also this global food crisis, which is a very serious concern, damaging economies around the world. So were Ukrainian officials reassured today that they will get the weapons they need and that there isn't this sort of trying to dance at two weddings, as one would say?
Well, certainly we heard from Volodymyr Zelenskyy that he wants more and that he is grateful for the support that he's getting. What else would he be able to say? Of course, we do not know what was discussed behind closed doors, but certainly Emmanuel Macron has taken quite a lot of criticism, both for saying that an accession process could take decades, which is certainly not what Ukraine hoped for, and that one will have to talk to Vladimir Putin soon. The German chancellor, for his part, stresses wherever he goes, it's almost an identical sentence, that nothing will be done over the head of Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Ukraine, and that it will be up to Ukraine to say what they might be willing to put on the table. If anything, Volodymyr Zelenskyy has clamped down in recent days, saying that they won't give an inch of their territory, that also they want previously seized territory on Crimea. They want all of that back. So it would be a big surprise if behind the scenes there was a completely different game going on, suggesting to Zelenskyy that he has to hand over something. What is, though, the declared policy of Germany, which the Chancellor said in the background, but he's also said it publicly, to support Ukraine to hold ground until Russia is ready to talk. And it is explicitly not to win the war. You will not hear from the German Chancellor that he says Ukraine must win, but he says that Russia must lose.
Michaela, do stand by with us. We will be hearing more of the press conference shortly, and we will be speaking to you about that. But now we would just like to go straight to Kyiv and get an update from our correspondent, Emmanuel Scholz, who's standing by at the iconic Maidan Square in the center of Kyiv. Hello to you, Emma. Tell us just how significant this visit from the European leaders is and how it's been perceived by people in Kyiv.
Well, of course, Mariana, on a diplomatic perspective, this visit is historic. This is the first time since the beginning of the war that a visit from the leaders of France, Italy and Germany takes place here in Kyiv. It is something that Volodymyr Zelenskyy has welcomed. He has already met here in Kyiv many leaders, world leaders, but not those of the three biggest European countries. Added to that, the president of Romania was also here. Romania, which is welcoming hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees since the beginning of the war. Highly significant because Ukraine is trying to access the European Union, and the fact that the four leaders present are actually backing this candidacy, well, this is a very strong signal that the support to Ukraine is really here. Also, the fact that they are here in a country at war, well, this is highly significant because it's quite easy to send words of support, to send thoughts and prayers from the safety of Paris, from the safety of Rome or Berlin. But it's quite another strong signal to come here in a country at war to express this support. And I think this is seen as a gesture of goodwill here, but also you have to know that there have been a few mishaps of communication here, perceived as such here by the Ukrainian population. For example, when Emmanuel Macron, the French president, was saying that the West should be careful not to humiliate Vladimir Putin, the Russian president. Well, here, you know, families all have relatives that are affected by the war when they're not affected themselves. The Ukrainians are paying the highest price of this war with their own lives. They witness destruction constantly, so obviously they wouldn't really care about humiliating Vladimir Putin right now. And of course, the fact that Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, was a bit indecisive, not really communicated very well the decisions made in Germany. Germany, you know, has operated a U-turn in terms of its foreign policy, its defense policy, by deciding to send weapons, including heavy weapons, to Ukraine. But it hasn't been communicated very well. And also, there have been considerable delays in delivering them. Here, Ukrainians would like to see concretely on the ground, where are those weapons?
Emmanuel, how far do you think this visit by the German Chancellor will go towards repairing the perception of Scholz by Ukrainians as being lukewarm in his support? Will he be able to repair this view of him?
I think, Mariana, on a diplomatic level, this is a huge win for both sides. Volodymyr Zelenskyy can see that he can count on the support and unwavering support of the West. Also, Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, said again that Germany would not just help in a one-off operation, that Germany was here on the long haul to help Ukraine. But the thing is that, like I said, people on the ground want to see results. They need heavy weapons. There's a list of weapons that Ukrainian officials also published to say, well, concretely, we need those weapons to be able to defeat the Russian army on our territory. And because this hasn't happened, well, the reputation of both Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, and Emmanuel Macron, the French president, isn't at its best here. We certainly are not going to see people waiting to see them and shake their hands.
The kind of help that Ukraine has been asking for, we heard yesterday from the former president, Petro Poroshenko, who said Ukraine needs weapons, weapons, weapons. But what that means is sort of the hardware. But another weapon is, of course, the wide-ranging sanctions that have been imposed on Russia by many countries, both inside Europe and also outside of Europe. And yet the reality is that even with all of the sanctions that have been implemented, Europe still relies on Russian gas. And is that going to still be a hindrance to Ukraine being able to succeed against Russia while Europe essentially continues to finance Russia's army?
Well, this is exactly how it is perceived here, that Europe continues to finance this war by buying Russian energy, while Ukrainian people are paying this war with their lives and their livelihoods and their territory and their culture. So, of course, Ukraine would like to see, and Ukrainians would like to see, a full embargo on Russian energy, something that they haven't seen so far. Of course, Volodymyr Zelenskyy welcomes the measures already taken. There have been extensive packages of sanctions against Russia, including against Russian energy, but there's still billions of euros that are being wired to Russia every month, and those euros actually still finance the war. So Ukrainians would like to see that stop as well.
DW's Emmanuel Schez reporting for us from Kyiv. Emmanuel, thank you so much. We'd like to bring you a story now from Ukraine's Luhansk region, where the governor has again underscored the urgent need for more military support. He says Russian forces are advancing in their assault on the key city of Severodonetsk, and he said that a Russian airstrike hit a building sheltering civilians and killing at least 3 people in neighboring Lysychansk, which is a city in Donbass that is also taking a heavy toll.
In the distance, the sound of Russian shelling. For the people in Lysychansk, the twin city of Severodonetsk, the chance to escape is getting smaller and smaller. Ukrainian police officers drive from house to house to find those who want to leave. But for many here, it feels like they're giving up their town.
We weren't sure until it became unbearable. Then I got sick.
She has an endless list of illnesses, and I'm also sick. If there was a hospital here, I would have stayed here until the very last moment.
Only a few kilometers away in Severodonetsk, leaving has become nearly impossible. With all the main bridges destroyed, the city is now cut off. Ukraine says more than 500 civilians are hiding inside the Azot chemical factory alongside Ukrainian soldiers. Moscow announced a humanitarian corridor for the civilians, but then claimed Ukrainian shelling disrupted the plan. With Moscow having more manpower and weapons, it's becoming increasingly difficult for the Ukrainians to hold their few remaining positions in the city. A Russian deadline for the forces in the chemical plant to surrender has passed. Former Ukrainian President Poroshenko told DW Ukraine will not give in.
Situation is extremely difficult, and the concentration of troops there is enormous. But our heroic soldiers is keeping Severodonetsk. We keeping the Azot chemical plant, and we never surrender.
Away from the Donbas, Russian forces have been aiming for other high-value targets. This footage, shared by the Russian military, claims to show high-precision, low-range missiles targeting a depot in the western Lviv region, where ammunition for NATO-supplied weapons is stored. If true, it could be Russia's latest effort to disrupt the international supply of weapons.
As we've been reporting, the leaders of Germany, France, and Italy are in Kyiv, meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. They've been holding a joint news conference. And here's what Zelenskyy had to say just moments ago.
Russian aggression is aggression against Europe, entire united Europe. It's aggression against us, against our shared values. And therefore, we should be united in our response. Today, Ukrainians are in the front line, fighting against the Russian strikes, but we are not alone. And today's meeting, today's format proves that we understand each other fully. We know and we understand that we need to reinforce Ukrainian defense.
That was the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy speaking at a press conference in Kyiv just a little while ago. With me in the studio to unpack some of that is DW's chief political editor, Michaela Krifner. Hello, Michaela. So Zelenskyy really underscoring how important this visit was to show unity. What does that mean concretely?
Well, it means that he was heard by the three leaders the four actually, including Romania, who came to visit him, because what they did bring is their backing for EU accession candidate status for Ukraine. Ukraine cannot join NATO. It doesn't have a prospect to join NATO anytime soon whatsoever. But those shared values, that's exactly the European Union once you take it beyond trade. And now he has Europe's most powerful countries basically standing in for Ukraine when EU leaders decide on Friday possibly to make or even that path for Ukraine, which would amount to a fast track. There's no two ways about it, despite calls by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz that the West Balkans must be first, essentially, that Ukraine cannot jump the queue, and at the same time warnings from the French president that an accession could take decades even, yet he stands there in Kiev and makes that commitment. So politically, this is quite a step forward for Ukraine.
And yet, even with all of these promises of support and encouragement for Ukraine on its path to EU membership, the reality is that Europe continues to depend on Russia for its natural gas. I mean, despite all these sanctions, they're still continuing to pay millions and millions of euros to the Russian treasury every day, which goes to support their military. So how does Ukraine reconcile this?
Well, it can't. That's why Volodymyr Zelenskyy already is calling for a seventh package of sanctions. 6 have already been implemented by the EU, and that would include a full embargo, full sanctions on Ukraine, on Russian energy, including those vital gas supplies. But Germany, Europe is simply still too dependent. Just one illustration is that the levels of gas sent through that Nord Stream 1 pipeline directly between Russia and Germany have gone significantly down. It's still, which Germany perceives to be for purely political reasons, although there's a maintenance issue also. And we see the Vice-Chancellor, who's also the Energy Minister, call on Germans to reduce their use of energy. Germans are called on to save energy. Now, that is quite a remarkable call by the German Vice-Chancellor, and just highlights the kind of dependency. And the argument on the European side is, look, if we implement sanctions, that means that gas prices could go up even further, meaning that the gas that Russia is selling could be delivering even more earnings for Russia. So if there are sanctions, they really have to hit Russia and not Europe first. So that's where the two sides are pretty far apart still. At the same time, there's more commitments for the delivery of weapons. The French president was very concrete. He said he would send 6 more Caesar howitzers. Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz said that he would continue to supply weapons to support Ukraine, with, of course, that criticism hanging over him that he does pledge a lot, but that very little, particularly when it comes to heavy weapons, nothing has really arrived on the ground yet. And this is a key concern for Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who needs it, and he needs it fast.
Olaf Scholz has also been criticized for taking this long to actually visit Kyiv. I mean, he famously said that he wouldn't go for a photo op. He wants to go once he can actually offer something concrete. I found it also very interesting that he didn't go alone. Is there more to his decision to travel with other European leaders? Is there more to it than just a show of European unity, or was there a kind of concern that there could have been a kind of a negative atmosphere or confrontation as a result of the tensions that there have been in Ukrainian officials' perception that Olaf Scholz is not supportive enough?
Well, Germany, Olaf Scholz is seen as way too hesitant, both by the Ukrainian population, but also by other allies, particularly the Eastern Europeans, are very critical of Germany, feeling that that Olaf Scholz is not decisive enough, that he's dragging his heels when it comes to supplies. When it comes to that visit, we do have to actually just get a bit of background. Germany's president was unwelcome when he declared that he wanted to visit Kyiv, and that is because Frank-Walter Steinmeier, also a social democrat like the German Chancellor, is the former German foreign minister and one of the key architects of Germany's foreign policy towards Russia.
Michaela, we understand that Olaf Scholz is about to speak, so we'd like to listen in.
Ukraine is waging a heroic war, defense war against Russia. And it's admirable how Ukrainians fend off Russians. And, President, we pay the greatest respect to you for this. Together with my French colleague, the Italian and Romanian president, I came here to Kyiv in order to express this to you personally. It's very clear this aggression on Ukraine marks the change of a time, of an age. And what Russia is doing here is unacceptable. And therefore, Germany, together with many other countries in the world, has stood very closely, together with many other countries of the world, by the side of Ukraine. We support your defense of the territorial integrity with major financial donations and humanitarian aid by accepting more than 28,000 refugees in Germany. 135,000 children now go to German schools. And Germany waved goodbye to a long state tradition. We support Ukraine with the delivery of weapons. We will continue to do so as long as Ukraine will need our support. And right now, we train Ukrainian military on the Cheetah and the howitzer. And in addition to this, I promised to deliver surface-to-air missiles, and which can defend an entire city. And with the United States of America, and the UK, and we signed an agreement, and we will provide Ukraine with rocket launchers. As you can see, Germany is lending massive support to Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, my colleagues and myself came to Kyiv with a clear message. Ukraine forms part of the European family, and one milestone on your road is the accession status to the European Union, and this is what the member states of the European will discuss over the next days. We know we need unanimity amongst 27 member states. On the European Council, I will support a unanimous decision. Germany is in favor of a positive decision in favor of the Ukraine, and that also applies to the Republic of Moldova. And this is a matter of European credibility, that towards the states of the Western Balkans, which have embarked upon this road for many years, we finally live up to our promise to actually specifically vouch in favor. And we have clear criteria which need to be complied with for accession to the EU. This applies especially to the acquis communautaire when it comes to democracy and constitutionality. Democracy and constitutionality are what we unite, what unites us and sets us apart in the European Union. Last but not least, allow me to state the obvious. The EU needs to prepare itself for this development and needs to modernize its structures and procedures. Ladies and gentlemen, Ukraine shall live. Slava Ukraine.
Дякую, шановні колеги, журналісти. Ваші запитання, будь ласка. Німецька інформаційна агенція DPA. Якщо stand up, please, for us to see you. And the microphone.
If you're just joining us, we've been hearing from a press conference in Kyiv.
Thank you very much. Michael Fischer, Deutsche Presse.
The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was just speaking, and prior to that, we heard remarks from Mario Draghi and Emmanuel Macron, and also Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the president of Ukraine. Let's now go to our correspondent, Rebecca Ritters, who is standing by for us in Kyiv. Hello to you, Rebecca. So a very historic visit by the leaders of the three largest European countries. Did the Ukrainian president get the promises that he was looking for from those EU leaders?
Well, Mariana, more or less, I would say yes to that answer. I don't know exactly what his laundry list was or his, list of hopes and wishes were. But I did speak to Dmytro Kuleba, the foreign minister, just before that press conference and asked him whether or not they were happy on the Ukrainian side. He said, you may not be surprised, there's not going to be any huge announcements, but I think there's a reason for everyone to have a smile on their face. So I think that's representative. Of course, Zelenskyy has since tweeted, or rather put out on Telegram, that this visit shows that Ukrainians are not alone in their fight against Russia. So I think in large part, yes. I mean, the big thing, what they received, what they got was European unity and solidarity, that they were not alone. That was repeated over and over again by all the visiting leaders. They all said that we are here with you, Ukraine. And of course, most significantly, they really put their weight and back and support behind Ukraine's bid for EU accession to become a member of the EU. They said they would back the candidacy, and I say that's probably the biggest thing to come out of this. Another thing that was perhaps not surprising, but was hoped for, certainly on the Ukrainian side, and I know that they were worried, they publicly said that they were worried that they were actually going to get demands from the delegation in terms of territory to go for a peace deal. That didn't happen. The leaders were at pains to say that Ukraine is a sovereign nation. It is up to them to decide when they will go into peace negotiations and what they will negotiate over. So there were no demands on that side. So all in all, I think that the Ukrainians did get what they wanted today.
Well, Rebecca, we just heard the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz say that he came with a clear message that Ukraine is part of the European family. How do you think this may help improve the perception of Scholz in Ukraine, where he has been criticized for being rather sluggish in his support for the country in its battle against Russia?
It's true, there's been a lot of criticism against Chancellor Scholz from within Ukraine, also within Germany and elsewhere in Europe for the lack of speed with which his promised weapons have come, and also just not that they haven't promised enough. This visit will, I would assume, help that image slightly. It may not go all the way that Scholz would be hoping for, that it may not, paint him in a completely wonderful light, but I think it is going to go some way to improving his standing here in Ukraine. He was at pains to say that they would continue supporting Ukraine with weapons as long as is needed. Unfortunately, none of the heavy weapons that they've promised have arrived in Ukraine yet. So, everyone here hoping that not only the promise of continuation, but the promise of delivery.
DW's Rebecca Ritters reporting for us from Kyiv. Rebecca, we appreciate it. With me still in the studio is DW's chief political editor, Michaela Köfner. So, Michaela, we just heard from the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz saying that Ukraine is part of the European family. But I found it interesting that he made a point of also mentioning the states of the Western Balkans who have also been on the path to EU membership. What did you make of those remarks?
Yes, and also Moldova was singled out, that Germany and leaders there would, but particularly Germany, would also be in favor of Moldova's candidate status, which of course is also crucial in relation to Russia. Clearly, the West Balkans and Moldova are areas where there is a large part of the population that really looks more towards the east than the west. And these are countries that are still to decide which way they are going to go. So it very much is a geostrategic issue, what the decision there will be, and that perspective is becoming all the more important. And Olaf Scholz and EU leaders are worried that there could be disappointment in the Western Balkans if now suddenly Ukraine gets to jump the queue. But when we're talking about candidacy status, that means that Ukraine also, despite being in a war, will have to face up to some very concrete demands, that there will be no easier passage into the EU, particularly also against the backdrop of a certain enlargement fatigue within the European Union. And here there are issues like corruption. I thought it was very telling. It was the special envoy for the European Union, Alexei Chernysov, who was there for Ukraine's President Zelenskyy, explaining what happened in Irpin to those European leaders, to Emmanuel Macron, to the German Chancellor. And they were talking briefly about corruption. We could hear it kind of on the B-roll. And he said, well, look, the war has really changed that. But we all remember, and it feels like a very long time ago now, that there were private jets and that oligarchs were leaving the country, that Ukraine has a huge issue with corruption. And here the argument is, look, this is something that the war has changed overnight. The big question mark is, do those issues really go away? And this is a very complex and potentially very long process, but the political commitment is now there from these European leaders at least, which is still a far cry from unity within the EU, as we all know.
Of course, the timing of this visit is very significant because it is a day before the EU is going to announce its decision on whether they're going to accept Ukraine on its path to membership. Do you still think that they could possibly be rejected at this point?
EU doesn't work with rejection necessarily, but it could be delayed. And a question like that becoming delayed is already a point scored for Vladimir Putin. So it will be very interesting to see what kind of exchanges will be there. I just want to remind us all when in NATO, there's also EU countries within NATO, and when it was a done deal or everybody believed it would be a done deal, that Sweden could join, then suddenly you get problems with Turkey. So unity behind the closed doors doesn't mean that unity actually holds when you really face the music. So that also counts for the European Union.
Yeah, we'll find out more tomorrow. Michaela Krivna, Chief Political Editor, thank you so much. Always great to hear your thoughts. Well, speaking of NATO, NATO is vowing to bolster its forces along the alliance's eastern borders in the face of Russia's aggression. NATO defense ministers have been meeting in Brussels as the alliance aims to reset its strategic vision. The meeting comes ahead of a summit later this month that will seek to set a new course for the coming years. Speaking after the meeting, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said Russia's invasion of Ukraine would change NATO's security strategy long term.
Russia's war against Ukraine poses the biggest threat to our security in decades. So we must set out NATO's response for the longer term. At the summit, we will take decisions to make NATO even stronger and more agile in a world that is more dangerous and more competitive.
A short time ago, I spoke with our Brussels correspondent, Terry Schultz, and I asked her what NATO's response might be given the new challenges that Jens Stoltenberg says are now facing the alliance.
That's right. The NATO Secretary General calls Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the war on Ukraine, a game changer for the alliance. And he has said in the past that NATO is going to have to live with a degree of uncertainty now that this is the new normal. And so the alliance is having to reallocate its resources. This is not how it expected to go into the future. But just in the last few weeks, in fact, they're talking about a new model for NATO's resources. And that includes putting more troops, more ammunition, pre-positioning equipment along the eastern flank in what was initially thought just to be a short-term reinforcement. Now those reinforcements are likely to be permanent or at least long-term, since, of course, no one can predict either the length of the war in Ukraine nor what Russia will do after that. So this is certainly a new way of thinking in NATO, and they're right now drafting what they call the strategic concept, the next 10-year plan for NATO, and that is going to be presented at the summit, and it's likely to look very different than one would have thought even a year ago.
Well, NATO also has said it wants to increase its support for Ukraine. What could that look like?
Well, what NATO does is coordinate support among allies for Ukraine. It doesn't have its own weapons. But what was talked about at this defense ministers meeting was in particular moving Ukraine from the donations, the contributions of allies from Soviet-era equipment, the type of thing that was rushed there just when the war started, to NATO-grade equipment, really upgrading what is given to Ukraine to what NATO countries are using. And one of the reasons for that is quite practical. They're running out of ammunition for the old equipment. It's not made anymore. And so the Ukrainians are pleading for more ammunition, and it's simply not available. So as they are able to train Ukrainian soldiers on the new equipment, NATO allies are going to be giving these more modern weapons. And of course, we did hear just at this NATO defense ministers meeting that they're going to be getting multiple rocket launch systems, something the Ukrainians have been asking for and which they are now able to use as well.
Well, just yesterday, the French President Emmanuel Macron again talked about the need for Ukraine to negotiate with Russia, albeit once the war was won by Ukraine, as he put it. But the idea of Ukraine negotiating with Russia, do other NATO countries agree that this is key?
I think the context is really important. Nobody would argue that they should keep fighting instead of coming to some sort of a peace deal. But there has been a lot of outrage among some of the countries that feel that Macron is giving too much to Putin, giving too much credit to Putin. Of course, we've seen comments from Chancellor Scholz also that have been met with some displeasure by some NATO allies. Comments like Russia should not be humiliated, we should treat Russia as a great power. This, of course, is very disconcerting to countries, especially along the eastern border there. You've heard the Baltic states ask for phone calls to President Putin to stop. They think that no one should be negotiating with him over the phone, that nobody would have called Hitler back in World War II, and that's a comparison that they often use. So I think there is a lot of rumbling about the Macron statements and ones that he's made in the past, because it depends a lot on what the situation is on the ground, and that Ukraine not be asked to give up territory that Russia illegally took from it.
Well, you mentioned Latvia, and Latvia's defense minister said he wants more NATO troops, and he's fed up of paying for lunch for the others. Is this possibly a sign that NATO has some cracks?
There are certainly differences between the way some of the eastern flank countries, particularly the Baltics, view this situation. There has been some displeasure with the fact that the Germans announced a large contingent of troop reinforcements for their enhanced forward presence, the one that they lead in Lithuania. And then it was sort of discovered a bit later that these troops wouldn't actually be on the ground in Lithuania, that they would be trained and they would exercise with Lithuanian troops, but they would actually stay home in Germany unless they were needed. That is not what the Baltic countries want to hear. They've long been asking for more boots on the ground, more troops stationed permanently on their territory. That's something that Poland is also interested in. And so I think that as the negotiations on this new model stretch over the next 2 weeks heading into the NATO summit, you're going to see a lot of back and forth on just how many troops should be forward stationed there on the eastern flank and how many can be trained and resting at home. But there's going to definitely be ammunition prepositioned, some heavy equipment, so that the movements of these reinforcements, these pre-assigned troops, could at least be more quickly done than it would be today.
DW correspondent Terry Schultz in Brussels. Terry, we appreciate it. Thank you. Let's turn our attention now to some of the other stories making news around the world this hour. Australia's new government has announced a pledge to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 43% by the year 2030. It was one of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's key election issues. Officials say the country is turning the corner on climate change, blamed for extreme weather events that have battered Australia in recent years. Well, searing heat has caused France's national railway company to limit the speed of its trains in the country's southwest. The measure aims to prevent the dangerous overheating of infrastructure. Southern France has been hit by a heat wave expected to reach up to 40 degrees Celsius. The actor Kevin Spacey was granted bail by a London judge after appearing in court on sexual offense charges. A plea hearing has been set for mid-July. The alleged assaults took place between 2005 and 2013. Allegations against the Oscar winner emerged years ago during the Me Too movement. Spacey denies any wrongdoing. Nigerian authorities are searching for 17 people who were kidnapped in the capital, Abuja. A user on Twitter posted a message saying she had been taken by men disguised as police officers.